Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm Sylvia Maru, correspondent at CNBC, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session, where the main question for us this morning is it business as usual? Essentially, what we were going to be discussing is how can firms navigate the complexity, really, of today's politics. And in order to do that, let me introduce to you our distinguished panel this morning. I have next to me Neil Wallen, CEO of Brunswick Group. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Henry Wang, he is president and founder of Center for China and Globalization. Arantxa González Laya, she is Dean of Paris School at the International Affairs at Sciences Po. And Philippe Varin, Chairman of the World's Material Forum and Vice President of the International Chamber of Commerce. So thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting discussion because there's a lot happening in the business world as a result of today's politics. And one key event, of course, has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that's where I would like to start today's conversation because we saw, Neil, a lot of companies having to exit Russia in the wake of the invasion. Was it independent corporate decision, or were companies forced by public opinion to leave the Russian market?
Well, Sylvia, thank you for that question. I just want to start by saying how delighted I am to be at the Paris Peace Forum. This really is one of the premier platforms globally where governments and NGOs, civil society, think tanks, academics, and of course, companies can get together and think about the world's most important issues and to craft solutions and then take action. And so it's a real pleasure to be here. You know, I think, Sylvia, the reality is that over the last set of years, companies have understood that they have a larger group of stakeholders to think about than just their shareholders, and that what their employees think and their customers think and what governments think are all highly relevant to how they engage in the world, how they think about geopolitical issues, how they think about social issues. And so Russia invaded Ukraine, and I think for many companies, especially companies in the US and in Europe, it was a watershed moment. They heard from their own employees, they heard from their customers, they understood that the reputational issues and the reputational stakes were very high. No government told them they needed to leave Russia, although there were obviously sanctions. No one forced them as a bloc to leave. But we spent a lot of time talking to a wide range of our clients across sectors and across home geographies, and they understood that staying in Russia, given the circumstances of the war in Ukraine, was something that could be very damaging to their reputation with their own employees, with their future reputation about hiring talent and acquiring more employees, with their customers and so forth. And a lot of them made the simple decision, did they want to be on the right or on the wrong side of history? And many of them, thought long and hard because there's a lot of money at stake, investments that they were going to lose, or business opportunities or profitability that they were going to give up. And for so many of them, especially again in the US and in Europe, the decision was to forego that and to make clear, partly in response to their various stakeholders, but also in the basic judgment that to stay in Russia was to do something that was very risky and ultimately to be, as I say, on the wrong side of history.
I want to follow up with you, Henry, on that. How did you view that movement? We saw the invasion started, and then it was somehow of a domino effect. One company started exiting, and then more and more companies were exiting the Russian market. From a Chinese perspective, how did you view that? And are you afraid that in the future the same could happen in China?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Sylvia, for your question. And I really, again, I echo Neil's point that this Paris Peace Forum is really fascinating. I was at President Macron's section yesterday, and he really, is really expected to play more leading role in defending the multilateral system. What I think the question you raised is really a very timely question, because I think now the world is really more divided, more campaign-like, these different camps and things like that. I certainly think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is really the kind of a breaking point of the globalization, because there is a huge setback, huge retreat. So I think, what we could do is we should really reinforce the globalization, particularly all those economic alliances like WTO, like CPTPP or RCEP or DIPA or, all those, rather than we're having a lot of more, security alliance now. And so if everybody is really become more, military hawkish and defense more, that'd be really also quite risky as well. I think what we could do, we should really strengthen multilateralism to really to sort out the conflict and really get back, uphold the UN Charter and the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and also, all those companies that should work together. So I think the business community have a huge role to play. I think from Chinese point of view, China doesn't really, really want to see too much sanctions going on because that hurts global economy. For example, China's 72% of energy depends on the import. So the oil prices gone up. It costs China billions, if not trillions. So I think that morally we should really stand up. Recently, President Xi and Chancellor Scholz has met. China strongly condemned any nuclear threat or any nuclear proliferation of using the nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons or dirty bombs and like that. So I think that position is very clear. What I think for the business community, we have to really work together, strengthen the prosperity, strengthen the linkages. I'm glad to see after Scholz's visit to China, 8 to 10 top business leaders from Germany published in the Frankfurt Times that really they want to see more not decoupling, but more really have to work together. So I think the company around the world should work together to build a more prosperous world, to offset recession, inflation, crisis of energy and the famine. That's where we should go. And of course, everybody should really work on the UN principle, and that is really the multilateral system China is defending on that.
And Anche, is it feasible to expect multilateralism to be reinvigorated? Because from where I'm standing, I've seen more and more protectionism, particularly since COVID-19 started.
You're absolutely right, Sylvia, that we've got a bit of a philosophical moment in our global economy. We were coming from a very strong geoeconomic positioning where basically the underpinnings of the global economy were open markets, share regulation, rules of the game that would allow everyone to share in the benefits of a more global marketplace. With rules of the game, I want to stress this because it was never as if there were no rules of the game. There are rules of the game. And this is what has allowed us in the last decades to lift millions out of poverty through growth, through innovation, through competitiveness, and this is what has allowed the rising of middle classes around the world, and in particular in a part of the world, in Asia, where right now we can see the importance, not just to Asia, but also to the rest of the world. Now, right now we are at the moment when geoeconomics is colliding with geopolitics. Where the laws of economics are in reality being trumped, and sorry to use this word, by geopolitical considerations, where nationality matters more than efficiency, where security, which is important because we are seeing how much the war is taking us back to a need to guarantee a bit more security. But security also needs to be married with efficiency. So we are in this collision between geoeconomics and geopolitics, and it is in this collision that having a strong multilateral playground, having a strong multilateral traffic warden, some multilateral rules of the game is more important than ever. And by the way, to those who don't believe in multilateralism, go back to see what happened in the WTO last July, when all members of this organization, even those that today are at war, put their differences aside and got to agree on a set of rules, including rules to reduce subsidies to overfishing or in maybe what could give us a bit of a sense of a way to go. Yes, it's going to be a much more geopolitical economy. We have to live with this, but yes, we should not remember that at the end of the day, we need an economy that is not fragmented. We need an economy that will continue to help us innovation, competitiveness, and ultimately jobs.
Philippe, on this point, is it feasible to expect these developments? How do you see these protectionist comments? In particular, for instance, I'll just give you one quick example. The United States with U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, there's concerns in Europe that this is not good for European companies. Is it feasible to actually expect progress in terms of multilateralism in the coming years?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the view from my position in ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, right? We represent 45 million members of the Chambers of Commerce and in 130 countries. And our founders, 100 years ago, because it was just after the First World War, they really thought that fostering trade was very good for peace and prosperity. It's what we have seen in the last 14 years. So there is no real reason to change our mind here. And, if you look at the relation between business and states, these relations exist in diplomacy for a long time. And currently, business is fighting for, in Europe at least, for 450 tariff barriers. If I trust the market database in the EU, we are also fighting on 150 dumping cases, right? We are fighting for having reciprocity in public markets and so on. So we are doing this with the states. But there is today a new trade order because tense geopolitical tensions, and here fragmentation is everywhere in trade, in CO2 markets, and perhaps more interesting also in digital. You think the digital is the highway for data, which is not true, right? We have cyber, we have IP theft, and so on. So there is a new trade order, so a need for corporate and states to have a much closer partnership to share intelligence and data for cyber, to share also a strategic vision on access to raw materials, for instance, for the environmental transition. So definitely, this partnership is very new, is very intense. You cannot imagine today that a car maker in Europe, which has to have a take-or-pay for a miner in a developing country in Africa, to take a take-or-pay contract without having the state behind, the states on both sides. So, to take your point, in this context, for the access to raw materials, but take the IRA, where it's interestingly enough, the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't speak about inflation, neither on CO2 prices, right? It says we have to ensure autonomy for the energy transition, for the environmental transition, and the materials together, okay? And the way to do it is to put on the table $367 billion as incentives, right? Which shows that it's something we have never done. It's not a usual, transition for wood to coal to oil to gas. It's something which is new. And China has worked on this question since 20 years, putting a lot of money on the table to get access to raw materials with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the SOEs, be it the miners, be it the car makers in China. Now, the US have reacted with IRA, definitely. And obviously, this is a matter of discussion because for the companies who are dealing in the US and those who are not dealing in the US, there is definitely a distortion of competition with these strong incentives for the future. So the EU has now reacted with the Critical Raw Materials Act, but it's fair to say that we are a bit late in the process. And also it's a very different situation on raw materials. China has taken a view that he has to secure the raw materials for 20 years. the US have a lot of raw materials inside the US, but also in North America with Canada, and also the access free markets with Bolivia and so on. But the EU is going to have, for 70% of their needs in 10 years, will still be in a position to import. So if we import, we have to secure the imports. And it's here about a new partnership, especially with Global South, and especially with Africa. But it's not the traditional partnership where we say, okay, the North is going to put its new standards on responsible mining and whatever, because the countries in the South, they want to be part of the co-construction. They don't want help. They want to be part of this new climate change approach, and they want value for them as well. When in Africa we have, I guess, 2/3 of the population below 25, Africa wants jobs, and Africa wants value sharing of these new supply chains. So it's a big change going on, and Europe is not at the same place as China, and not at the same place and the US. So we have to find our way.
It's weaker. Is that what we're saying?
Well, it could be a real opportunity for the future. But we have to change the business model here. If we do what we have always done, we've got to have a problem.
Neil, based off of what Philippe just described, how can businesses navigate this complexity? And can they be the ones, should they be the ones actually forcing some changes here towards multilateralism? Because from the political point of view, it seems like we're not heading in that direction.
You know, I think it's a terrific question, Sylvia. I think businesses have a role, consistent with what I said earlier. You know, they understand that their judgments and how they move forward in the world need to take account of a broader set of issues, a broader set of stakeholders, a broader set of considerations than ever before. By themselves, of course, you know, they are unlikely to be able to be the solution to these things, whether it's climate or the war in the Russian war in Ukraine or what have you. But I do think they have a role, an important role, working with government, working with civil society, understanding that a lot of the issues that we're talking about, whether it's the implications of the war in Ukraine in energy markets, in food markets, whether it's global public health, we've obviously just all globally experienced that, whether it's climate, all these issues are at their root global issues that require global solutions and therefore effective multilateral structures, which may well need to be adjusted, because I think in too many cases the post-World War II set of institutions have had troubles and increasing troubles of late in the face of, as Arantxa said, sort of the clash between geopolitics, or the tensions between geopolitics and geoeconomics. So I think, you know, companies, for their own purposes, but also for all their various stakeholders, again, their employees, their customers, the regulators, and so forth, I think want and need increasingly to be part of solutions that are effective in trying to make progress on these very difficult but very global questions. And that requires a certain amount of multilateralism. I just wanted to say on this question of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is related to all this, of course, you know, for a long time, the world, I think very understandably, has said the US needs to step up on climate issues in ways that it really hadn't heretofore. And so the Biden administration and the US Congress came up with a very rich package of support and incentives to try to get the private sector rather, in the US to be full participants in making real progress on climate. Now, that of course, as you suggest, has raised concerns in Brussels, in European national capitals, about the competitive implications of all that. But you know, every country around the world is and needs to be thinking about how to create support, not just from the public sector directly, but also to incent virtuous behavior in the private sector to make the transition more effective, to speed it up. And I think the US has stepped up in a way that it hasn't done before to do that. I have no doubt that there are all kinds of complexities that have, you know, competition implications from the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of those are being expressed now in Brussels and elsewhere in Europe. It's still early days for the Biden administration in implementing this statute. And I am confident that both there will be lots and lots of conversation and that we will get to a place where the competition issues in the end will be worked through. But I don't think there's any sort of credible way forward that doesn't involve the US government trying to push or incent our private sector into doing things that are, in the end, again, from a global perspective, critical to making real progress.
Let me just make a quick point that we will want to hear from you, from our audience. So I'll make sure we have some time for your questions. I'll get to that in a moment. I see some excited faces. That's good. On this point, though, I actually want to go to you, Philippe, because we have heard from President Emmanuel Macron speaking of a Buy Europeans Act. Should the European Union go ahead with this idea?
Well, you know, the EU is, I cannot speak for the EU authorities, right? But they've always been very in favor of market economy, level playing field, and so on. So there is no question about this. But I think now in some areas, like the question of access to raw materials, for instance, for the environmental transition, we are not in an unusual game. You know, if this transition was really completely consistent with the market economy approach, then there will be no change. But it's not the case anymore. The state has to be involved one way or another. And nationality becomes very important because we have to have the link between business and the states. So I have not heard of Buy European Act, but clearly the Inflation Reduction Act raises some questions of competition, and then this is under discussion.
Let me interject, because Europe has a Buy Europe Act. It's just that the way Europe does it is with reciprocity.
Yeah.
So we do Buy Europe, but if you are China and you give me the same treatment, I'll buy from you too. Because at the end of the day, it has to be to incentivize domestic production and domestic economic activities, but it also has to be about efficiency. So it's Buy Europe or Buy America or Buy China with reciprocity. Now, the problem is when reciprocity is not there. And I have to say that on this one, it's got to be a bit of say what you do and do what you say. Because if you don't do it, it's going to be seen as you not being credible. And if you're not credible in one area, others will feel they can be less credible in other areas. So we go back to the beginning of this conversation, whether fragmentation and the loss of efficiency and competitiveness that it brings is a preferred avenue to open markets with reciprocity and rules of the game.
I actually wanted to get your thoughts, Arantxa, on the recent trip of Chancellor Olaf Scholz to China, because there was a lot of criticism in Europe, in particular here in France, just concerns that Germany has not learned this lesson from the dependency they had with Russia. How did you view this trip, and do you think that the policy should actually be decoupling from China?
Well, it's pretty clear that in Europe, like in America, there are certain areas where we are not in agreement with China. And it's pretty obvious. And we don't hide this. There are policies, stances, which we do not agree with and are a concern to us. But it's also clear that when you're dealing with a country that is 20% of global GDP and represents 15% of international trade, and that is China, you cannot apply to this country the same medicine that you apply to a country like Russia, which represents 0.7% of international trade and 1% of global GDP. So I always like to go back to figures because they give us a sense of how rational our choices can be or cannot be. My sense is that, at least from a European point of view, it's got to be partnership, it's got to be rules for competition, and it's got to be a space for rivalry. Now, there is a space for cooperation, and we have to use it. As Neil was saying, if we are to guarantee financial stability globally, if we are to fight pandemics, if we are to succeed in the fight against climate change, we have to talk and discuss with China. And if we want to avoid a nuclear weapon from being used in the European continent, maybe we also have to speak to China. And this is where I value that the German Chancellor went to China, had a conversation with the Chinese leadership around an issue that is a big concern for Europe, which is the use of nuclear weapons in the European continent. And the message that we got from President Xi, I think, was useful.
Definitely very clear from the Chinese president. Henry, let me come to you on this as well. From a Chinese business perspective, how do you navigate these conversations that are happening in Europe, in the US? Because the US clearly has problems specifically on the tech sector with China. The message there does seem to go towards decoupling. Then you see the Germans going to China, trying to make a business there. How are Chinese businesses trying to navigate these different approaches from the West?
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. I think that, we've been going through, since World War II, the Bretton Woods system, up to now, 76, 77 years. The war has prospered. I mean, one of the fundamental, I think the U.S. champion about is free trade, the economic of law, and also the market forces. And now it seems to go back to the decoupling, and particularly this recent semiconductor decoupling is very, very damaging and devastating for the whole global. I mean, also we are not really practicing the competitive advantage. So I think that's really all those against economic rationale and the common sense, which I found is very unfortunate. I do think that business, though, but including Chinese business, has to do a bit more in terms of really benefiting and be more balanced growth, not only for the domestic company but also for the countries they are operating in. So same is true for the U.S. company as well. European companies too. They make a huge money in China, but they also have to benefit, Rust Belt, Midwest, so that the gap between the middle class and rich and is not that big, so that China won't be very often become a scapegoat. So I think we have to do our domestic, address domestic issues for all the companies. I think China now really find probably a unique hybrid mode. For example, 60% of Chinese companies are private. Employs about 80% of the employment, and also another 20% of SOE does all the dirty works and public goods works, and for the benefit of the works that private companies sometimes don't do. And then there's another 20% multinational, which does 50% of China import-export. So this trilateral, hybrid economy, I think, is really working in China. And so I think that we should really, strengthen the international rules, and the Chinese company should follow the international practice, but also give the same treatment for all the company operating in China. Multinational Chinese company the same. So I think we have to do a lot of things to do that. But I think in the end, we have to remember where we got so far. By what competitive advantage, the economic law, and those intertwined of economic. If it's go back to the primitive, let's everybody reinvent the wheel. We probably will see no progress. We probably go back, and also it's very dangerous if we really decouple, and then everybody does its own. It's really, we are living a very dark days ahead. So that's really something we have to avoid.
But one of the key questions there is whether China itself is ready to offer the same conditions to Western businesses in their territory. Is China ready to do that?
I think they do. Actually, we see the 20th Party Congress just concluded. I see the Chinese National Development Commission spokesperson actually at a news conference said, they're going to treat multinational Chinese company, private sector, SME, all the same. Even the Supreme Court Justice had said that too. So they will be still open. President Xi said the China door will be open wider and wider. So I think you can expect now with the COVID relaxing. Yesterday, China announced they're going to cut down the quarantine time. They're no longer going to cancel any flights coming into China. So I think things are moving to the right direction. I think that will really help the revival of the Chinese, circulating back to the world. The dual circulation, they have to circulate it back to the world. With 150 million tourists outbound, we're probably expecting in the next few years from China. So I think there's a lot of good news that China is now opening up, and we hope to see that happen more, with more foreigners come to China, because China now have the largest middle class now, and they're going to create another 400 million middle class with the common prosperity in their mind. And I think there's huge potential for all the multinationals everywhere in the world.
Let me touch on a macroeconomic aspect with you, Philippe, because as we start to get some news out of China that it's relaxing some of the COVID-19 rules, I just would like to understand, what are your thoughts in terms of what the China reopening of the economy will mean for inflation? Do you just think this is actually going to drive prices higher, or it could actually do the opposite?
I'm sure of one thing, that inflation is here to stay, okay? And if we are very serious about our net zero objective in 2050, very serious about going to this environmental transition, and China is going to be a big part of it in terms of access to materials and so on. And what is ahead of us is huge in terms of supply, demand, and balance. Just give you a few simple figures. Just on the last year, the carbonate of lithium, which goes to the batteries, price increase times 500%. If you take lithium and copper, nickel and copper on the last 2 years, it's close to 100% increase. Close to, because there is some fears about recession, which has a little bit dampened. But the trend is demand in nickel will increase probably 3 times in the next 10 years for batteries. Lithium, 4, 5 times in the next 10 years. Rare earths for magnets, 4 times. At the same time, you have this explosive growth on demands, and on the supply side, then you have a lot of constraint of production. Just have in mind that for nickel, we'll be led to open 70 new mines in the world, and it takes 7 years in average from a decision to open a mine with the permitting and all this, and the reality. So you have, on the last 10 years, the 20 top miners, which were investing $100 billion 10 years ago. 5 years ago, we were only investing 50. So we were at a trough. We are slightly increasing, but there is no spare capacity. And the yields of the mines are decreasing. If you open a copper mine today, if you have a copper mine that has 0.5% of copper, you are happy. 3 years ago, it was, 5 years ago, it was 1.5. So there is also the NIMBY, not in my backyard, which is the big issue. If, in obviously developed countries and also developing countries, so more and more stringent regulations. And you have also the climate impact on water, and water in mines is very important. So if you put all this together, I mean, disruptions are very likely. So there will be tensions, and there will be inflation. And we have to be prepared for this. And if China opens post-COVID, this would obviously increase trade and consumption, which is the good news, but there will be more probably trends on demand as well. But the fact is that we are, on the planet, we were investing $2 trillion per year in infrastructure. We go to $5 trillion for them. And this will be a strain into all the materials, and there will be an inflation, not by demand, but by supply.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Let me open the floor to questions. I see you, one in the second row. If we could pass the mic. Thank you so much. If you could introduce yourself and then ask your question, please.
Should I stand up or sit down?
Sorry?
Should I stand up or just sit down?
Up to you, up to you.
Hi, good morning My name is Ivan Krampus. I am a recent graduate in international relations from University College London. I'd like to thank the panelists for saying their insightful arguments and presenting their case about the current impact of geopolitics towards trade and companies. I'd like to ask about the issue of over-reliance. Is the current economic impact of sanctions against Russia or the fallout from zero COVID in China towards manufacturing a result of continuous over-reliance? And is it right to say that we have to move back supply chain or energy production to places outside Russia and China, which can be seen as quote-unquote unreliable partner? Because the panelists, all of you four have said like it is also important to talk with geopolitical loggerheads like Russia and China. I was wondering if moving back manufacturing and energy production is actually against the principles of multilateralism. Thank you very much.
And you, oh, I see you're ready to. You go ahead, Neil.
Well, I mean, I think it's not one or the other. I think there's certainly an increased emphasis, and understandably, in the wake of COVID, in the wake of competition between China and the West, in the wake of the Russian war in Ukraine, there's, I think, a move in the direction of self-reliance, in the direction of resilience, making sure that, you know, efficiency isn't the only thing that people are thinking about in respect of supply chains, but also effectiveness. So I think inevitably in this moment in time, that's the direction in which we're headed for reasons that strike me as understandable. It doesn't, I think, diminish the need for the criticality of multilateral, effective multilateral institutions and efforts to think about the world's big problems. And both of those things can happen to some extent at the same time. I don't think it's the case that the world is fragmenting and everyone's heading to their own corner, although there is some move to pay attention to in the circumstance of COVID or the next global pandemic. Will individual countries, will individual companies be in a situation where they can look after their own interests in a way that is about resilience and risk mitigation? And I think there is some amount of the world sort of fracturing or fragmenting into blocks, you know, but I don't see, you know, full-on deglobalization. And I think that the importance, as this panel is, I think, reinforced, of continuing to think about and build toward effective multilateral efforts on these big issues in the world is undiminished by this sort of economic reality that we are observing, and I think we will continue to observe.
Arantxa.
Yeah, I think the key is to review your risk management strategies. Where you're a government or you're a business, you need to review your risk management strategies. And in this risk management, give a higher coefficient to security. Now, that doesn't mean building a wall. If you look, the EU has done a very interesting evaluation of critical raw materials that are necessary to power the European economy. And it has found that a big percentage of these raw materials are basically today sourced from one or two origins. The question there is basically to ensure you have a wider variety of suppliers to rely on for your critical needs, whether they are resources, whether it is labor. We're not talking about this, but this is also an issue if you want to be a competitive company. And for that, so if the issue is review your risk strategy and make sure you have a wider available choice, multilateralism is what it gives you that. Because then you have a way to get this from more sources with, let's say, greater ease. So I don't think there is a contradiction, but I think we were living in the world where this element of risk was not sufficiently taken into account, and it now needs to be embedded into the risk management strategies.
I'll come to you in a second, Harry. Philippe, I also know you want to say something.
Well, just to complement what Arantxa has said, there is no today one corporate which is not looking at reshoring, nearshoring, multi-shoring, and all this. That's what we have to do anyway. But if you look at the impact of this fragmentation globally, this will have an impact. It's an insurance cost premium that you are ready to pay. So it has a cost. And this cost will have an impact on growth, on innovation, on development, because there is some kind of isolationism. And this cost, at some point, I'm not convinced that the voters in the countries will support their politicians if this creates a problem of purchasing power for them, with increased inflation and so on. If the developed countries which do this, they don't find people for the jobs. If you near reshoring, you have to have new jobs, employments, and there is a crisis of employment in a number of countries as well. So that's here that people will think again of a new multilateralism. And it's the reason why in ICC, we are the interlocutor of choice of WTO, and we were very pleased on MC12 to see that things were not, WTO was not dead, right? And in the future, what we are trying to set up with Mrs. Ngozi is a business advisory group for WTO to really build on business and corporate coalitions to support multilateralism.
Harry.
Yeah, I think this is a very fundamental problem. Actually, we see the globalization be, really drive for the last 7 decades. I mean, we have a global market now. We're not talking about domestic, home territory market. We're really aiming at the global market. We're having Fortune 500 company, half of them is income comes from internationally. So I don't think we're going to really going back to this, because China now, because all the multinational in China they are in China for China. It's not in China for their own home country. They are making money in China, and because they want to expand the Chinese market. China has the biggest middle class, and then China has the 7th largest container port in the world, and also 2/3 of a global super railway, and 5 million of 5G stations, and 280 million college graduates in the working population, with every year 10 million added up. So I don't think any multinational, if they're aiming at the global market, would not, abandon China market. So this decoupling, I don't think is going to work, because you have to lean China for China. You have to have the international growth, global growth for your own benefit in your own country, and then China is a must, that country you have to work in.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid that we are running out of time, so no more time for questions, unfortunately. But hopefully, even though we have realized that it's not business as usual for companies, the complexities, though, if the managers manage to adapt to these complexities, then they perhaps will see new opportunities. So I would like to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And of course, thank you to you as well for joining us. I'll see you next time.